out my dear colleague in the History Department of American University, one of the leading scholars of immigration, especially U.S. immigration, and university professor at American University. And you have a lot of information also in your little catalogs.
Thank you very much, Michael. Welcome all of you this afternoon to our panel. I'm going to begin just with a few introductory remarks and then introduce each of our panelists at the very beginning so that I won't have to interrupt and we can have the flow. We hope to have time for lots of questions. So, in her memorable 1943 essay, We Refugees, published in a small Jewish journal called Menorah, the young refugee philosopher Hannah Arendt described the term refugee as meaning those of us who have been so unfortunate as to arrive in a new country without means and have to be helped by refugee committees, end quote. What did she see? What did Hannah Arendt see as the characteristics of the refugees of her generation? Let me describe it as she does. Our optimism is admirable, even if we say so ourselves.
We want to use their legal expertise to make a difference.
The story of our struggle has finally become known. We lost our home, which means the familiarity of daily life. We lost our occupation, which means the confidence that we are of some use in this world. We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions, the simplicity of gestures, the unaffected expression of feelings. We left our relatives in the Polish ghettos, and our best friends have been killed in concentration camps. And that means the rupture of our private lives, end quote. The echoes of Arendt's powerful words can be heard quite clearly in the present. Now, according to the UN High Commission for Refugees, there are a record 70 million forcibly displaced persons, including 25.9 million refugees and 3.5 million asylum seekers. In the past, since the end of World War II, the United States led the way in responding to the plight of those necessarily on the move. However, that seems to be on the verge of a dramatic change. The current administration has released recommendations that suggest its hostility to such resettlement, and at least one member of the president's inner circle, Stephen Miller, a descendant of Jewish refugees, has been quoted as saying that he would be, quote, happy if not a single refugee foot ever again touched America's soil, end quote. Meanwhile, the state of Israel continues to be a refuge for Jews in flight as it has long been, and in addition, it is now the destination of many non-Jewish migrants in search of employment and sanctuary. The presence of Sudanese and Eritrean migrants in pursuit of permanent refugee status has caused political turmoil in Israel, as you heard in earlier presentations, and is part of a controversy that has enshrouded the Netanyahu government. The Prime Minister reneged on a deal which would have allowed Israel to send some of the migrants to European countries while giving others permanent residence in Israel. With so much going on with respect to the movement of refugees and the response to the plight of refugees, it is the perfect time to hear from some experts who can speak to the complexities of the issue from various perspectives. And we are most fortunate this afternoon to have a panel of experts to do just that. I'm going to introduce them, as I said, all at one time, and then each will have 5 to 8 minutes, give or take a minute, for opening remarks. Our first presenter is Julie Fisher. Ms. Fisher is the founder and director of the Consortium for Israel and the Asylum Seekers. She worked in education in Boston and Washington before moving to Tel Aviv with her family in 2011. In her role as wife of the U.S. ambassador, she engaged with educational, medical, and philanthropic institutions around Israel, highlighting the partnerships between the U.S. and Israel, supporting programs to engage minority communities, promote women's health, advance religious pluralism, and support education, cultural, and humanitarian programs. And over the past 8 years, she's worked with the NGOs and our other partners on projects to improve conditions in child care facilities, provide humanitarian support, and advocate for the needs of the asylum-seeking community. She created the Consortium for Israel and the Asylum Seekers, specifically to bring attention to the needs of African asylum-seeking communities in Israel and to gain the involvement of volunteers, donors, and communities in Israel and abroad. Our second presenter is Mutassim Ali. Mr. Ali is an LLM student at George Washington University's Law School in International and Comparative Law. He's currently working on a book with Moriel Rothman-Zechar, the author of A Sadness is a White Bird, about his own life in the Sudan and his experience seeking asylum in Israel, where he was the first Sudanese refugee to receive official status in 2016. Our third presenter, and an old friend of mine, is Donald Kerwin. She has directed the Center for Migration Studies of New York, the CMS, since September 2011. He has previously worked for the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, Inc., known as Clinic, between 1992 and 2008, serving as its executive director for 15 years and its interim editor for a short period of executive director for a short period thereafter. Upon his arrival at Clinic in 1992, he coordinated the agency's political asylum project for Haitians. Between 2008 and 2011, he served as vice president for programs at the Migration Policy Institute, which is an affiliation of mine, and he has also served as a member of the American Bar Association's Committee on Immigration, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations Immigration Task Force, and he served on many boards and advisory groups. He writes and speaks extensively on immigration policy, refugee protection, access to justice, national security, and other issues. He also founded and serves as the executive editor of the Journal on Migration and Human Security. And for those of you from the AU community who may be wondering about his last name, Don is a first cousin of Neil Kerwin, who was a very distinguished president of American University. Our fourth and final presenter is Mark Hetfield. Mark is the president and chief executive of HIAS, the world's oldest organization dedicated to refugees, which was founded in 1881 as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. A global agency guided by Jewish values in assisting refugees of all faiths and ethnicities, HIAS works on behalf of the organized U.S. Jewish community in partnership with the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR, the U.S. government, and the government of Canada. HIAS has worked in the State of Israel since its founding, where its Rutkin Fellows Program currently provides legal assistance to asylum seekers. HIAS also administers the U.S. Resettlement Support Center in Tel Aviv and provides scholarships for immigrants to Israel. An attorney for over 30 years of public, private, and charitable sector experience in the field of migration. In 2016, he was named to the Forward's 50, America's leading Jewish newspaper. Many of you may know it by its older Yiddish name, the Forward, a paper my grandfather read daily. One of the 50 members of the Jewish community with the greatest impact on American life. A frequent commentator on refugee issues in major media, Mark holds a Bachelor of Science in Foreign Service and a Juris Doctor from Georgetown University. And so without further ado, let me turn to our panel and let me ask you if you would begin.
Thank you to Laura and Michael. Is this working?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you to Laura and Michael and everyone at American University for putting this conference together. When I told everyone in Israel who work on this topic on the ground that I was coming over for a conference on the issue of African asylum seekers in Israel. They were touched and surprised that it was getting attention enough to have an academic conference on the topic. So thank you for highlighting this important topic. Laura, your personal commitment to this issue over the years is inspiring, and thank you for spending your birthday with us today. Happy birthday. It's great to be back home in DC. I don't say that lightly. Not only did I live in this beautiful city for 18 years, but I was actually born here. My home for the rest of my childhood was in Duluth, Minnesota, and that is where I met refugees for the first time, an unlikely place, perhaps, to meet refugees. Late one snowy night, we went to the airport to welcome a family of Vietnamese boat refugees. The memory I hold with me from early childhood is watching them arrive with only the clothing on their bodies and not even a single toy for their 3 children in tow. Fast forward to my first year in Israel, several decades later, where I met another refugee, a young Eritrean woman who had just arrived after being kidnapped from a refugee camp in Africa, trafficked through the Sinai Desert, where she was ransomed and tortured, and that was my jarring introduction to the African asylum-seeking community. With that introduction, I'm here as an on-the-ground community activist and volunteer to talk about civil society. Others have talked about research and numbers, and that's not my role. I've prepared some slides for you to illuminate the situation on the ground. We're going to see if it works from here or if I need to.
No.
How do I roll?
Press it.
No? Okay, am I too far away? Yep. All right, thank you. This one? And go back this one? Oh, it does work. It's a PDF, so we weren't sure if it would work in the same way. Here you see a child in a playpen. Here I was in a new place, wanting to escape the bubble of diplomatic life. With my background in education, I began to volunteer in an overcrowded childcare center. Center is much too nice a word for these baby warehouses or babysitters, which they are called on the ground. There are fewer of them now, thanks to some incredible work of NGOs like UNITAF and Mesila. But there are still way too many, and they usually have 40 to 60 children, sometimes with only 1 or 2 caregivers. The tragic deaths of several babies in one winter caused the community to take action, and the government also took a bit of action, sending some money over to the municipality of Tel Aviv to figure out that problem. The expat and diplomatic community did their part as well, and we ran a gun safety program where we went in to repair open and broken windows, cover outlets, and install safety gates in the hope that no more tragic deaths of babies and toddlers would occur in these awful babysitters that are all over South Tel Aviv and populated by the children of non-citizens, mostly African asylum-seeking children, and also other non-citizens in the community. At the bottom here, you see something that illustrates the humanitarian support that is going on. On the left, you see a line to receive food from many years ago when people were still arriving and directly being transported to Levinsky Park by bus and dropped off there. People came together to provide food there in Levinsky Park. That kind of situation isn't happening in the same way now, thankfully. But on the right, you'll see that we still have vulnerable members of the community that need humanitarian support. And so you see some examples there of people collecting food, NGOs like Pesia's Kitchen and Leket, Mothers Make a Difference, Mesila, Asaf, lots of great NGOs doing good work, and the people in the community who are working with them to help. At the top here, you see an example of a project was done in Hatikva neighborhood, one of the oldest Jewish neighborhoods in Israel. This gan, this child care center, was the victim of a hate crime by the neighbors, the unhappy neighbors, who dumped feces and dead rodents in the playground of this child care center, leaving the playground unusable. The diplomatic and expat community jumped in to repair the playground and also to do a mural to try to give some emotional support to this beleaguered community. And this was the final product there. And on the bottom, you see an example of a resettlement project that took place that maybe some of you have read about. It got a little bit of press, which was the kibbutz resettlement project. 12 kibbutz communities around Israel took in over 60 people from South Tel Aviv, many of whom were the most vulnerable in the population, those who were about to become homeless, about to turn to prostitution, and able to feed themselves or their children, and those were on the short list to be moved to a kibbutz to get them into a better situation. Here's an example of some engagement and educational projects that are going on. On the top left, you see a group of students from New York University visiting at Kuchinate, the Women's Refugee Cooperative, where they make baskets. Some of you may have heard of them. If not, Google Kuchinate and learn more. They came in for a talk, and on the right you see an APAC leadership group. One of the goals that the volunteer community has had is to engage those in and outside of Israel to learn more about the situation of African asylum seekers in Israel. How did they get there? Why are they there? What are the needs of the community now? And how can everyone help and pitch in any way that they are able? And we've been very, very proud to say that dozens and dozens of groups have come down to South Tel Aviv to learn about the issue, including groups that perhaps are not traditionally thought of as pro-refugee groups, but some center and right-wing groups as well who want to educate themselves. On the bottom here, you see something very special, and some of you who are in Tel Aviv know Sister Aziza, Sister Azezet Kidani, winner of, you see in the little picture on the bottom right, Secretary Hillary Clinton presenting Sister Aziza with a Hero of Our Time award for the work that she did documenting the torture in Sinai. She is a nurse and a nun from Eritrea. She holds British citizenship, and she lives in Jerusalem. As in her work as a nurse, ministering to people's physical ailments, she was one of the first to learn about the horrible things happening in the Sinai and to record what happened there. She is one of my heroes. Here you see my friend here on my right. And we were engaging with groups of visiting Americans at the GA conference last year in Tel Aviv, where we were able to talk to hundreds of visitors about the situation in Tel Aviv. And on the right, you see Usmain and Tamara, whom some of you know from formerly of the Hotline, speaking with another group from the Jewish Funders Network. One of the goals that we've had is to engage people in learning more about this topic. And on the bottom, you see additional outreach to policymakers and leaders. So on the left, you see Canadian Ambassador to Israel, Deborah Lyons, who has been a staunch supporter of refugees around the world. And she is now in Israel, and she's supporting our efforts. And on the right, U.S. Congressman Ted Deutsch, who visited UNITAF, an NGO that provides safe childcare for over 1,000 children of asylum seekers in Tel Aviv, and now has recently expanded to Rehovot. Skills and employment. You see here some of the wonderful NGOs like African Resource Development Center, Kuchinate, and others teaching marketable skills like cooking and artisan crafts. On the bottom of the top slide, which appears in the middle, you see a very innovative program where 30 asylum seekers were matched with 30 professionals in the high-tech sector to provide individual mentorship, and this was hosted by WeWork. Some high-tech companies in Tel Aviv have partnered with some of our NGOs to provide employment to refugees. It's been a really exciting development. On the bottom, you will see the launch of the African Student Association, which Mutassim can tell you much more about. But dozens of African asylum seekers are now studying at I think almost all Israeli universities across the country. which is wonderful. Many of the strongest in the community have become self-sufficient and have left to places where they can get their full rights. And this is, of course, great news, but also challenging news to those of us who remain to work with the community, because the most vulnerable are left behind. I spend a lot of my time with that segment of the community, the most vulnerable. Partnerships. This picture, the big picture in the middle, gives me great hope. You see partnership between asylum seekers, Israelis, both progressive and extremely traditional. This is not your typical partnership, but sometimes unlikely partners team up together to solve community problems. The challenges for this community are serious, but the Israelis who are dedicated to repairing the fabric of their society and welcoming the stranger are inspiring, and I relish the chance to highlight their work whenever I can. The bottom here, you see 3 examples of solution to problems that were fixed by the civil sector, not the government. On the left, you see tents in B'nai Brak Visa Center, where some of our friends in the room have spent far too much time waiting and waiting. A group of volunteers and philanthropists came together to raise money and install the tents and porta potties and benches for asylum seekers who waited for hours and hours and hours on end, sometimes in the scorching hot sun, sometimes in the pouring rain, without anywhere to go, and sometimes with their children. You see on the right, example of children of asylum seekers who have been moved to kibbutz communities, where they have schools, fresh air, all the food that they need, and a temporary safe situation. And on the bottom, you see the repaired, can't see it very well, but trust me, it's the repaired playground in Hatikva, the Gan in Hatikva, where now children can play, which was repaired by the community. So government options have stagnated in many ways, but as you can see, some challenges continue to be addressed creatively by the hardworking people in the NGO and volunteer communities. Good people solving problems, not waiting for the government. Thank you for letting me show you the snippet of life on the ground now, and I look forward to entertaining questions further in the program. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's an honor to be part of this amazing panel.
Closer to the mic.
Oh.
Use Julie's mic.
Do you hear me? Oh.
Okay.
There was actually my mic in the beginning, by the way. I just switched it. Yeah, but I'm just saying I'm honored to be part of this conversation with great friends, Julie and Mark and I also would like to thank the Center for Israel Studies for highlighting this important issue, especially for me as somebody who is coming from Israel, and I have a bigger community behind. They expect so much from us who made it to America or to Canada, for instance, to speak about their plight. We somehow consider ourselves privileged to have this opportunity and speak to audience like you. So thank you for that opportunity. I got it, yeah. Thanks. One thing that I want to say also before I begin my presentation, I struggle a lot with my presentation and my slides. I kept changing them, since last night until today, because most of the issues were covered by Tali Chrisman, who was here yesterday, but also Dawid, who was a good friend of mine, and he stole my story. So, yeah. But to begin with, I'm inspired actually by the panel last night, and I would like to start with the quote to Israeli Supreme Court Justice Milzer. And he said in a decision about anti-infiltration law that was litigated by human rights organizations, as our forefathers themselves in the distant past, foreign workers in countries not theirs, and in the more recent past, have knocked on the gates of different countries, running from Nazis, and were rejected. We are required to apply the relevant rules with compassion and sensitivity to all those involved. He was referring to refugees and asylum seekers. And he said, "הדבר מתחייב מהיותנו מדינה יהודית ודמוקרטית." We are required to do so because we are Jewish and a democratic state. I'm one of the 33,000 African refugees and asylum seekers. And yesterday, Tali Christmas said she refrains from using the term refugee, but I intentionally use it because some of those who made it to Israel were actually recognized by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees in Egypt, for example. You may have a question, why then recognize as refugees in Egypt, but then they made it to Israel? That's a different thing. We can answer it later. And so the vast majority of refugees and asylum seekers from Eritrea fleeing repression of basic rights, as described by Human Rights Watch. A small minority are from Sudan, from the region of Darfur, Nuba Mountains, and Blue Nile. They're fleeing genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes as defined by the Rome Statute. And of course, there are few from Western African countries, from Nigeria, from Ivory Coast, and Guinea, and all of these countries. It was in 2005 when the first group of refugees and asylum seekers began to enter Israel. Most of, if not all, including myself, have been detained in the south of Israel for different period of times, for the purpose of screening, but mainly as a punishment for irregular entry to Israel. The number reached to about 66,000 refugees and asylum seekers from Africa as of 2012. In response to the influx of refugees and asylum seekers from Africa, the Israeli government erected a fence in 2012, which stopped the arrival of African asylum seekers to zero in 2019. No more asylum seekers are coming from Africa, period. And I kept repeating Africa because there are more people seeking asylum from non-African states, such as Ukraine and Georgia. As said earlier, there are about 33,000 refugees living in Israel today. The number decreased by half, yet the Israeli policy or Israeli government maintained an exclusionary policy to stop or deter additional asylum seekers from coming to Israel and to discourage those already in Israel from staying in Israel. The logic behind this policy is to make their lives or our lives miserable. This is former Minister of Interior, Eli Shai, referring to the intention to apply harsh policies on African asylum seekers until their removal is possible. It is for that intention a physical barrier was erected, a fence in 2012, as I said. But because some Israeli government officials argue that the fence cannot be trusted to stop the infiltration, the government combined the physical barrier with legal barriers, such as anti-infiltration law that amended a number of times, and the deposit law, the recent deposit law. Anti-infiltration law is a law that was enacted in 1954 in the wake of 1948 war to prevent Palestinians, Fidayeen, mainly from Jordan, Egypt, who intend to enter Israel to carry out violent attacks against Israelis and Israeli targets. So the government incorporated or used the term infiltrator to use to flag refugees and asylum seekers. Under this law, the term infiltrator, or who is found to be an infiltrator, is subject to Israeli criminal law. It could be 5 years imprisonment. This is according to the anti-infiltration law. Therefore, the term infiltrator carries negative connotations, including but not limited to security threat, social threat, and economic threat. The deposit law is an amendment to anti-infiltration law that was passed in 2013, which proposes the asylum seekers from Africa are required to deposit 20% of their monthly earnings into a private fund. In addition, also the employers are required to deposit additional 16% to that same private fund. All of this amount of money were supposed to be given back to the asylum seeker if he or she decides to leave voluntarily Israel. These policies and restrictions maintained by the Israeli government are not unique, by the way. Australia has detention facilities, as many detention facilities would say. The US, inspired by Israeli government, working on a wall. Denmark is imposing economic sanctions on refugees and asylum seekers, for example. But what is unique about Israeli policy is combining all of these measures together. The outcomes of all of these policies has tragic ends, such as my friend Abdul Azim or Muhammad Ahmad, who were both killed in South Sudan and Sudan respectively after their voluntary departure. Or Tesfaye Kedani, who was beheaded by ISIS in 2015 in Libya as a result of voluntary departure. Or Wajunga, a young man from Darfur who committed a suicide in 2018 in Israel. These are people I know, 3 of them personally, and there are many more examples. My argument here is that Israel's treatment of refugees and asylum seekers from Africa not only is inconsistent with the international laws, but also inconsistent with the declaration of its founding fathers that proclaimed the state of Israel will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisaged by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, or sex. And it will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. Thanks.
So why don't I try to start talking? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So what I'm going to talk about is not Israeli policy, but I'm going to talk about U.S. policy towards refugees. And I'm specifically going to talk about the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program, and then I'm going to talk more broadly about asylum, temporary protected status, and other protection policies. And I am going to talk in particular about this report that we wrote that looked at 1.1 million refugees and how they did in the United States over the course of 30 years. But first, let me say, this issue is very much in question right now. Why do we have to be honest with you, admission of refugees has never been popular. Never in U.S. history has it been popular. But right now, there's kind of an existential threat to this program. There are people in high places saying we shouldn't admit any refugees at all. And that's out there. So we're at the point where we have to defend this program and why we have a program. And these are some of the defenses that have been offered over the years. First of all, it provides hope to refugees, particularly those that are in protracted situations with no hope. It saves lives of the world's most vulnerable people. It allows people to restart their lives. I mean, you would think that that would be enough, right? But apparently it's not. It's in our DNA. It's part of our tradition. It's part of our heritage. It promotes a stable and moral world. That's a quote from the great Arthur Helton, kind of the migrant rights, human rights person who died in Iraq. It reduces unregulated arrivals, and it encourages developing nations, which host 85% of the world's refugees, to remain a part of this process. And it promotes cooperation from individuals, communities, and states that actually are important to our geopolitical strategies. And I might say our refugee program itself, as you know, has revitalized many cities, and we shouldn't forget that. So what we did is we looked at 1.1 million refugees who arrived between 1987 and 2016. We compared them by period of entry, broke them into 3 cohorts, and compared them with non-refugees and with the total U.S. population. And what we found is not surprising, but it is very much at odds with the kind of narratives that refugees are a burden, that they can't be absorbed, the kind of stuff we're hearing in our public life now. And we found that basically refugees are a smashing success over time in the United States. Those with the longest residence, those who entered from 87 to 96, have integrated more fully than the recent arrivals, of course, who came from 2007 to 2016, is measured in all these various ways: mortgages, English language proficiency. Look how naturalization rates go up. College education, labor force participation, employment, self-employment. Refugees who arrived between 87 and 96 exceed the total U.S. population in all of these various ways. And of course, that U.S. population is mostly U.S. citizens. Median personal income, home ownership, percent above the poverty line, access to a computer, being internet savvy, and health insurance. And then we looked at one population that we thought would be of particular interest to you all, persons from the former Soviet Union who arrived between 1987 and 1999, and we examined how they were doing in 2000 and then again in 2016. And look at the progress that was made over this 16-year period. Median household income increases dramatically. Personal income nearly triples. Households with a mortgage increase. Public benefit usage falls. And of course, there is heavy public benefit usage by refugees after they come, but after a while, this diminishes significantly. English language proficiency rises. Percent with a college degree increases. Naturalization rates double, et cetera, et cetera. Just very briefly, because I was asked to speak from 5 to 8 minutes, and I'm going to try to stick to that. It's not just the refugee resettlement program under attack, right? It's all U.S. protection programs at this point. The administration seeks to eviscerate, weaken resettlement, asylum, temporary protection, and other protection programs. And the strategies are similar to the strategies we've already heard about, which is to make policies that are so harsh and so cruel that people will not come, or those that are here will simply abandon their claims. And we see this on the U.S.-Mexico border, and we see this elsewhere as well. In terms of the refugee program itself, the recent developments are setting a ceiling for 2020 that's the lowest level in the 40-year history of the program, at a time, you know, as Alan pointed out, where there's record numbers of forcibly displaced people in the world. It's allowing states and localities to effectively veto the resettlement of refugees in their jurisdictions. If a governor protests, or if a locality protests or doesn't actually provide affirmative consent to the resettlement of refugees, refugees can no longer be resettled in those places. That's going to really, really be a difficult thing for this program. It's dismantling the community-based infrastructure that's been built up not just over 40 years, but over 50 and 60 years to resettle refugees. Some of the best people, some of the most important infrastructure that we have. I think the last statistics I saw were that about 100 refugee sites have now been shuttered, and we are sure that there's going to be additional sites shuttered. And then just this year, there's usually about a week, I think this is right, Mark, a week or two moratorium on resettlement of refugees within the beginning of the fiscal year. And we saw no refugees resettled this year for 5-6 weeks. So that's fairly extraordinary too, just basically a moratorium. So I'd like to urge you all to be heavily involved in these issues. Refugees are not a burden, they're a great contribution to the United States. And it would be a shame if this movement to weaken and to eviscerate refugee programs and asylum programs went much further. Thank you.
So I really enjoyed Alan's introduction because he referred to my organization as HIAS. And you can tell how somebody knows HIAS based on how they pronounce our name. Before 1970, everybody called us HIAS. And then when we started resettling Soviet Jews in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it was HIAS. And now we call ourselves HIAS. So I had to just note that. And now, speaking of the three HIASes, I'm going to speak for just a minute or two on our work in Israel, and then show a very short video, and then talk about a single day, which Alan also mentioned in his introduction, which is April 2nd, 2018, which is relevant to all the previous presentations. Now, first of all, HIAS's work in Israel, for many, many years, many decades actually, HIAS worked primarily with Olim in Israel. We tended to work in places also where the Sachnut, the Jewish Agency for Israel, could not work. So we would help people Jews immigrate to Israel. And that was the mainstay of our work. But then when we got a new director in Israel who had a lot of asylum experience in 2000, 2001, we realized that here's a country with such, as you heard yesterday if you were here, with such an important contribution to refugee law, to the Refugee Convention. And so it was important to actually have a course on refugee law in Israel, which did not exist at that time. So our director in Israel started the first refugee law course in Israel at Hebrew University, because at that time, the question of asylum seekers in Israel was primarily academic. There were a few asylum seekers coming in over the border, mainly from Iraq and other neighboring countries, but the phenomenon of Eritreans and Sudanese seeking asylum in Israel really did not happen until 2006, was when that started. So suddenly, we had a relevance of expertise that we had not had previously when that started happening, and so HIAS decided that we would help train the Israeli government to do asylum determinations because they had no asylum process at that time. And so that's what we did. We joined, we trained a number of classes of the first Asylum Corps of Israelis. We actually brought in Homeland Security trainers as well from the United States in those years to participate in those trainings or lead those trainings with us. But we weren't that happy with the results. As this is not something we brag about. The asylum approval rate right now is, as you've heard, the lowest in the developed world in Israel, and it's not because their cases are the weakest. It's because the Israeli government is sending out a deliberate message to err on the side of denying asylum, which they consistently do. And in fact, in the first graduating class of these asylum officers, where we were present at that ceremony, someone came from the Ministry of the Interior to speak to them, and he said to them, "You have a very important job. Your job is to stop this tsunami of infiltrators coming in over the border." And he was followed by what was at that time the representative of UNHCR in Israel, which was back then a volunteer position. And it happened to be Mickey Bavli, who is the son of Hannah Bavli, who was the Miss Manners of Israel. And he was also a seasoned Israeli diplomat. And he said, everything that guy just said, it's wrong. He said, your job is to find the truth. And, but unfortunately, Mickey's words were not the advice that the Asylum Corps followed. So we pivoted. HIAS no longer trains asylum officers in Israel. Instead, we have developed this core of what we call the Michael Rukin Fellows. And these are now about 200 attorneys and law students who take on the cases of asylum seekers, mostly in strategic litigation, but also in individual applications to make sure that they can get asylum or get protection in Israel. Very few are actually getting asylum, but this keeps them, we try to keep them out of detention. We try to challenge areas where we feel the state is in the wrong, such as the deposit law. And I'm proud to say that Mutasim was one of our law fellows before he came here. He was in our law fellow program. Now, we did make a short video about this program. It's only 2 minutes. This was for a competition called It's All in the Family that UJ Federation of New York put on. We were one of the finalist projects, and this was a competition to demonstrate big ideas where New Yorkers and Israelis could work together. Now, we lost the competition. In fact, there was a campaign by activists in South Tel Aviv, anti-asylum seeking activists in South Tel Aviv, to vote against us for this. But we still made a pretty good video for it. So here's the 2-minute video.
It's incredibly important that the Jewish community respond to the global refugee crisis for a very simple reason, and that is that throughout our history, the Jewish people have been refugees and asylum seekers ourselves.
Having legal representation makes a world of difference for the applicants. I think I've seen that the rate is they're 5 times more likely to be accepted for asylum because, you know, we're advocates. This is what we do.
HIAS wants to bring together the legal community in New York and Israel to help asylum seekers win their cases. We want to connect attorneys in both countries through trainings and peer learning activities. We believe this will not only help people in need, but also strengthen the bonds between Israelis and New Yorkers who want to use their legal expertise to make a difference.
This program is unique because I think it's the only one in Israel that actually builds capacity of attorneys to do pro bono.
They help me without money, and they fight because they need me to get status and to change my life.
Asylum seekers are seeking protection in both of our countries, and as lawyers who may be on different sides of the ocean but who share the same values, I think we can and should respond. And I think if we work together and learn from the success of the pro bono culture in New York, I think we can make our network grow.
Thanks. So in the last minute, I want to speak about April 2nd, 2018. Now, this was a day that we at HIAS and others in Israel had worked very hard for. Don talked about resettlement. And now refugee resettlement is when primarily developed countries help lesser developed countries and help asylum seekers and refugees in those countries by resettling them through a safe and orderly process. Now, normally you reserve this for countries that are incapable of absorbing the entire asylum seeker population that they have. And it was painful, but we decided to advocate that resettlement countries resettle a significant number of asylum seekers out of Israel, because the suffering, even though it is a developed country, even though there have been no new entries for several years now because of the wall, we figured enough is enough. The people have suffered enough. Let's try to find a solution to this problem of the asylum seekers in Israel who are in this perpetual state of purgatory. So we had been advocating with the UN Refugee Agency to promote resettlement of a significant number of asylum seekers out of Israel in return for Israel giving those who remain a durable status, a legal durable status. And we kept thinking, well, if only the Prime Minister knew, this would be the perfect solution to his problem, to his challenge, and everybody could be happy. And so sure enough, the UN Refugee Agency was able to convince the Prime Minister that this would be a good course of action. So on April 2nd, 2018, in the morning, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that 16,000, I believe it was 16,250 refugees, or he calls them infiltrators, of course, would be resettled to other countries. He specifically mentioned Canada, Germany, and Italy. He just kind of made those up. He dared not say the United States because he didn't want to provoke us, but many would have gone to the United States. That 16,250 would be resettled, and that an equal number would be given a longer-term status in Israel until it was truly safe for them to go home. He announced they were abandoning their plan to send people to Rwanda and Uganda. And he was saying he was going to also rehabilitate South Tel Aviv, and he was going to move as many of the asylum seekers as possible out of South Tel Aviv to other places where they would get jobs and job training. So it really seemed like a win-win for everybody, and all of us progressive Jewish organizations issued press releases for the first time congratulating and thanking the Prime Minister for his beneficence. And then we had to retract them several hours later, because before he went to bed that evening, the Prime Minister had second thoughts. And even after this big public fanfare and press conference, by the time he went to bed that night, he said he was rethinking the deal. And sure enough, the next morning, he announced that the deal was dead. Why did he do this? He got lots of praise from Hayes and Truah and other organizations that were on the left. And we don't consider ourselves to be a left-wing organization, by the way, but we are a pro-refugee organization. But he got a lot of negative pressure from the right, from Naftali Bennett in particular, and from Gideon Sa'ar, who was also challenging him for the leadership of Likud. Naftali Bennett said that, who was in his government at that time, I believe, said that the Prime Minister is proposing a paradise for infiltrators. He said the original plan of deportation was moral and fair, and we should follow, we should act according to it. And Gideon Sa'ar said that this plan shows weakness, Israel will be attracting illegal immigration if we do this plan. And so a lot of other people from that side of the Prime Minister attacked the plan, and so he totally retreated. The plan is still a possibility of doing this. The UN, I know, is still willing to put it back on the table, but I think we may have to wait for a new government to be formed to do that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, Mark outed me as a pre-1970 person. It's true. I want to allow enough time for questions from the audience, but let me first ask our panelists if you have comments that you'd like to make or responses to some of the presentations. Julie?
Hi. Thank you to all the other panelists. I wanted to mention our policy. So I talked about things that's kind of life on the street in Tel Aviv, and I want to jump on board with some of the policy statements that have been discussed also, because we are always trying to balance our time as volunteers in civil society between attending to the dire humanitarian needs and the urgent policy needs. And I only address the dire humanitarian needs, and I want to just throw in a moment on the urgent policy needs. So we have 4 real priority policy issues coming from the NGOs that I work with. And one is, of course, a fair and functioning refugee status determination process, which is not happening now. If Israel thinks that there are too many asylum seekers to check them individually, they could provide group protection with full social rights, as some other countries are doing. Number two, lifting of the deposit law. As Mutasi mentioned, and DeWitt, the deposit law, which takes 20% of all earnings of asylum seekers, has caused serious economic hardship, including rise in poverty, hopelessness, and a documented rise in prostitution. The harmful effects of the deposit law have been well documented by ASAF, the aid organization of asylum seekers in Israel, the Hotline for Refugees and Migrants, and Kav Loved, the line for the worker. So we have documentation and research that shows the negative effects from the deposit law. Number three, granting social rights and access to health and welfare services to allow the community to live in dignity. This is especially needed by the most vulnerable asylum seekers, those with disabilities, with PTSD, and ongoing medical conditions for adults and for children. And number four, stopping the ongoing incentives for voluntary deportation to Uganda and Rwanda, where we know asylum seekers are still going back to dangerous places, often ending up stuck in limbo or in terrible, often deadly situations in Libya or at sea, or statelessness in all sorts of countries in Africa. We know that although we're telling people in Israel not to go, not to voluntarily deport themselves, the ongoing hopelessness of the situation still means that some people are going, despite the information that we have about what happens when people leave.
Anyone else on the panel?
All right. Thank you so much for this valuable information. And I think I have a few comments, but Alan, you mentioned something about, refugees are not a burden, and this is really an important thing that people have to understand. And especially in the Israeli context, most of refugees and asylum seekers live in impoverished neighborhoods in South Tel Aviv, 5 main neighborhoods, and those residents are really struggling with their living conditions. And on top of that, we have, thousands of refugees automatically being sent from detention facilities or prisons in south of Israel to those neighborhoods. And so what happened in the end is it created so much burden, and of course, also, crimes issues and all of that. And when I speak about crime issues, also against refugees and also against residents, everybody's suffering from that situation. And one thing here is, it is important to acknowledge the pain of local residents. This is number one thing. Number two, it was one of the major mistakes in Israel is that refugees are being blamed for every problem that happens on those neighborhoods, or maybe even in Israel in general. They were speaking of having refugees as a burden, and they erected a detention facility in South Israel, Holod. They invested millions of shekels, to just make life miserable for refugees, mainly from Sudan and Eritrea. And yet they speak about having refugees in Israel as a burden, right? Like, instead of investing such amount of money in detaining people who Israel cannot deport by force to their countries of origin, that money could be invested in the local neighborhoods for the residents, right? Like, refugees are not in Israel seeking food or or humanitarian assistance. To be honest, people want to have an opportunity to live in a dignified way, and only if we can offer that opportunity, refugees can be an asset.
Yeah, refugees are a gift, not a burden. I think that's how we would put it. Do you mind if I say for a minute just what's happening on asylum in the U.S. too?
Okay.
Okay. So, in the later days, and Mark did a lot of groundbreaking work on this issue, but when you come to the U.S.-Mexico border, if you ask for political asylum or you say you fear persecution, the border officials are obliged to allow you to get into the U.S. immigration system. That doesn't always happen. The border officials haven't been sold on that historically. But what we started to see in the later days of the Obama administration, the early days of the Trump administration, was just basically total pushback on that legal requirement by border officials. So that, an asylum seeker fleeing a Northern Triangle state would come to the border and they'd be told, the country is full. Nobody today but Christian refugees. nobody from the Northern Triangle states. We only take people, who are at war, from countries that are at war at this point. So really, kind of any ridiculous, fatuous answer that they could come up with, they would use that to deny people protection. Subsequent tactics have included preventing asylum seekers from crossing bridges into U.S. territory, period, requiring asylum seekers to enter at ports of entry rather than cross a border. Why is that a problem? Because the cartels and the gangs control those border communities. So if you have to enter by a port of entry, you have to run that particular gauntlet. Requiring them then to register with Mexican officials to seek asylum in the United States. I mean, talk about crazy. Limiting admission at the ports of entry to only a trickle a day and not allowing admission at different ports of entry. Now it's requiring those who are pursuing their asylum claims to wait in Mexico during the course of their U.S. immigration proceedings, which would take months, where they're targeted by cartels and gangs. And literally, there's lots of cases of people killed in those cities. Entering safe third country agreements with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, meaning that if a migrant passes through any of those countries and doesn't ask for asylum and gets to the U.S. border, they're barred from seeking asylum there, and they're told to go back to El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, which are refugee-producing countries. They're not refugee protection countries, and they don't have the ability to accommodate these claims. And of course, they're not safe. It's a safe third country agreement, but they're not safe countries. And then, of course, Sessions' zero tolerance policies, which really nationalized policies like the criminal prosecution of asylum seekers before they can seek asylum. You criminally prosecute them. The separation of parents and their children, that had already partly been in effect. You've heard about the parents that have been separated from children. What you haven't heard about are the cases where they bring parents and children back together after their separation and demand that the parents sign an order of removal and concede to their own removal. And if they don't, they separate them again, separate them again. So, I mean, the cruelty here is beyond belief, and it goes beyond kind of normal, a normal acceptable array of policies. It's really, really beyond belief and beyond the pale at this point.
It is odd to as a historian, to listen to this and to think of two countries that advertise themselves as sanctuaries for the suffering of the earth, and the contradiction between what's happening on the ground and the reputation those countries would like to embrace. Let me turn to the audience, though, and get your questions. We've got about 10 minutes or so. Yes, ma'am.
Worldwide refugees, and then it seemed like blink an eye and it was 64 million, and now we've just heard recently that it's 70. So just for a sec, if any of you have any thoughts as to how this will go in terms of growing, and more importantly, personally to me, I started a vigil when at the embassy, at the Israeli embassy in Washington. I borrowed this from someone who brought it back from Israel. It was a weekly vigil on Tuesday nights with the threat of the expulsion of the African refugees in Israel. So I did it for 6 weeks. It was miserable in terms of weather and snow and horrible wind and everything. And one of the 6 weeks, David Schneier helped organize a great real vigil with lots of speakers and songs, and it was terrific. And had me bring Passover stuff. It was right before Passover, and wanted me to take maror into the Israeli embassy, which of course they wouldn't take. So I've spoken to somebody from New Israel Fund, and I've spoken to, and the last day that I was there, just one more thing. The last day that I was there, and I was pretty much alone each week, I went with congratulation signs because there was a Supreme Court decision. And it seemed like I got a bit of a vibration back from the people in the embassy on that one. I think they were with me.
Could you ask the question?
So I've been wondering whether to restart or whether I should not have stopped. New Israel Fund said, not now. Arik Asherman said, get back there. So I just wonder if any of you have an opinion, because I'm ready to be back and get more people. Sorry.
Do you want me to talk about the statistics?
Sure. Just briefly.
Yeah, so it's 71 million forcibly displaced people. It's about 26 million of them are refugees, and the great bulk of them are actually internally displaced people. And of course, there's some asylum seekers, some stateless people in there. But the basic reason is a simple one, that there's more refugee-producing conditions and situations in the world than there are solutions to people. And the way I'm starting to think about it, I mean, people aren't being able to return home. They're not being able to integrate into their new communities, and there's very little resettlement now. But most of the people in this room can get on a flight anywhere. But we don't need to, but we can. And if you're a refugee, you can't. And so the idea of kind of expanding the ability of refugees just to travel to anywhere where they might be taken through normal immigration programs is something that I think we really ought to push.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have a question for Mutasim. So I know that you're one of the lead activists for the refugee community in Israel, and I was wondering, since now you moved to the US, in which ways do you continue your activism here? For refugees in Israel, in Sudan, in United States, whatever.
All right. Thanks for the great question. Number one thing is by participating in events like this, because one of the things that we struggle with in Israel is that people really don't hear about the struggle of refugees in Israel. Not that people don't care, but they just do not have the correct information. And I think this is one of the things that it is important to keep telling the story, and for you also to engage. This is number one thing. And so my main mission here is, to participate in such events. But after I moved here, I think personally, sort of switching my focus from refugee issue in Israel to more addressing the root causes of the problem that led people to be refugees and migrate. And this is basically addressing the problem in Sudan, for instance. One of the main issues we are struggling today in Sudan is having genocide, we do not have a functioning state and all of that. And so my focus right now is more on, bringing about peace in Sudan. So by having that, we will be able to eliminate the problem of refugees and asylum, at least the Sudanese. And of course, my passion is always there to help my friends who are still in Israel, but also elsewhere, because, again, refugees and asylum seekers in Israel are only a small part of a bigger refugees and asylum seekers around the world. We have millions, over 1 million actually in Uganda, for instance. In Ethiopia, we have refugees, in Egypt, in Libya. And so there's so much to be done. But I think for me at this point, it is more to focus on the issues back home, and hopefully we'll be able to address this refugee issue by solving that.
Lady right over here. Laura, do you have the mic?
Yeah. One second.
Oh, I think.
No, right over here.
Okay, hi, illuminating from all of you. Julie, you said some very interesting things. As someone who worked on a kibbutz a long time ago, my ears perked up. You said that two different groups were getting aid from the kibbutzim, some older people and then some younger people, but you made it appear that it's temporary, it's time limited. So I'd like some information on that. I'm also curious as to how the people are being integrated, if they're learning Hebrew, if there's a possibility of their joining the kibbutzim. As you certainly know, the number of people living in kibbutzim has diminished, the number of kibbutzim has declined. This might be an interesting opportunity for them to grow. But again, it's a particular ideology, and some of the refugees may not be totally thrilled with that lifestyle, but it's temporary succor. So whatever you could share on kibbutzim and the refugee and asylum problem.
Absolutely. Thanks for the question. It's one of the many projects that we've worked on, and it's the one that has gathered the most attention from the American Jewish community, I think, because it's an interesting story. The stereotypical dying kibbutzim within Israeli society, but we have this idea of how they were in the 1970s, and the idea that the kibbutzim were stepping up to help with this issue. That narrative has gathered a lot of interest. So the story is that the kibbutz movement themselves, during the height of the deportation threat, almost 2 years ago, decided to step up as a movement and do something to help. And they appointed someone from their movement to be in charge of this. He began to drive kibbutz to kibbutz to talk to each kibbutz separately, because of course they all have to make their own decisions and vote on whether they wanted to host an asylum-seeking family or not. And he drove all over the country, and over the course of about a year, placed 60 people on kibbutzim. It's, when I was talking about older people and younger people, people were moved in family units, primarily single mothers and their children, because they're the most vulnerable. So the kibbutz movement worked with social workers in Tel Aviv from all of the wonderful NGOs to identify families who would be potentially a good match for this, because it's not for everyone, and tried to send them in groups 2 by 2 so they wouldn't be the only ones in a kibbutz. Through this project, it was really a way to show support, to shelter people in place temporarily. It wasn't saying you can become a kibbutz member, but of course, those of us involved in this were hoping that when people get to know real life other human beings and form friendships with them, that they are invested in their future. And so, of course, our hope, even though the kibbutzim technically only signed on for 18 months to 2 years, our hope was that they would develop bonds of friendship and community bonds and want to keep these vulnerable families, frankly, women and children who aren't getting deported anywhere because they can't send them, there's no one in that situation being deported right now, thankfully. But there are many of them at risk. So they identified them and moved them. It was also a way to show, frankly, there's all this talk about South Tel Aviv carrying this big burden of 60,000 asylum seekers and others. Now we know that those numbers in Israel, we believe that there are about half of the asylum seekers are in Tel Aviv and half have spread out around the country due to both governmental policies and people looking to find employment elsewhere. So the new numbers look a little bit different. And so this matched a government-stated policy objective of moving the asylum seekers out. So the hope was also to say to the government, look, we're doing a pilot project to move asylum seekers to kibbutz communities. Kibbutz communities are like North Tel Aviv, and everyone's saying, oh, only South Tel Aviv has asylum seekers. Well, look, the kibbutzim are showing us that, quote-unquote, North Tel Aviv welcomes asylum seekers. And so there were lots of different goals in this project, both safe harbor for the most vulnerable families and also to show a pilot project that we hoped would inspire the government to put in place for others.
I'm sorry, we've run out of time, and I know we've got another program coming up. So let me thank all of the participants, all of our panel members, for such fine presentations. And thank you for coming.